CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. It's the most recognized measurement of inflation in the finance world, and every month the BLS publishes its report, giving everyone a chance to see how much the CPI has changed compared to the prior year. This one measurement is arguably the most important variable the Federal Reserve looks at to dictate how much they're going to tighten, and as a result, for the past year, this graph has essentially dictated where markets will go. The higher it soars, the more aggressive and tighter the Fed has to act, which in turn results in more sell-offs, eventually higher unemployment, and finally, hopefully, lower inflation. Every single CPI report this year has had massive moves associated with it, and in today's video, we look at the extreme problems we could be seeing with the CPI as the Fed and the public ignore the long and harsh history of battling inflation, a problem that could lead to extreme consequences. For nearly 40 years since the early 80s, inflation has remained steady, a once forgotten concept only found in dusty textbooks. But following the great shakeup in 2020, inflation came back in a way we have never seen before. After falling in May to essentially zero, the CPI crept up and up, exploding past 9.1% in June of this year. This is one of the worst readings in history. In fact, because the methodology or the way CPI is calculated has changed over the years, that June reading may have been the worst ever, according to ShadowStats, a website that keeps track of CPI using the 1980 methodology. That month in June would have been around 17% using the old method. And a lot of people will argue that this is the true reading. If you look at an example like Pepsi, they just announced last month that their average price jumped 17% for the quarter, which some economists point out as the true inflation rate. Pepsi's prices are real prices. This means there's no hedonics or whatever crazy math the Federal Reserve attempts to use in order to manipulate certain aspects of the CPI. Remember that early on during the initial price spikes, many of these companies were eating the costs of higher pricing, thinking that inflation was transitory. Once this theory died out, we quickly saw companies forced to push prices higher and higher. And for many people who believe this will soon go away, history tells us a different lesson. For example, in 1980, when inflation got up to 14% as officially reported, Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, famously raised the Fed rate to 20%. This caused a recession and pushed mortgage rates to hit as high as 18%. It was an unthinkable act trying to break the back of inflation, fixing it quickly. This was a Fed chair who wanted to raise the rate past what inflation was and well past it, and yet despite this dramatic action, inflation throughout the 1980s rarely dipped below or around that 2% mark. This means that despite extreme action, inflation is a very hard cycle to break, and today's Fed's rate is nowhere near where the CPI rate is, which means that certain economists believe that we're in for a long period of sustained inflation, except this time when the Fed raises rates in an attempt to battle this financial force, it will do so with a massive debt burden that will cost the American public trillions of dollars in interest expenses. In fact, some believe that the situation is so bad the US will have a period of inflation worse than what we saw in the 1980s. We all know Warren Buffett. The billionaire is considered by many as the greatest investor on the planet, but right next to Buffett is his right-hand man, Charlie Munger. And while Buffett is very careful when pressed on certain issues and predictions, choosing to dance around questions like a master politician, Munger is well known to be blunt and straightforward. This personality trait was highlighted during a press conference last year, just as inflation and the economy began to turn. Munger shocked the world by predicting an unbelievable development in the markets, and he had this to say about inflation.
You may wish you had a Volcker. You may wish you had a Volcker-style recession instead of what you're going to get. The troubles that come to us could be worse than what Volcker was dealing with. When Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds, that was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without an interference from the politicians were very unusual. And I think in 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession. Think of all the Latin American countries that print too much money. They get strongmen and so forth. That's what Plato said happened in the early Greek city-state democracies. One person, one vote, a lot of equality, and you get demagogues, and the demagogues lather up the population, and pretty soon you don't have your democracy anymore. I think that accurately described what happened in Greece way back then, and it's happened again and again and again in Latin America. We don't want to go there. At least I don't. When you throw money, when you print money on the scale that modern nations are printing it, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc., we're getting into new territory in terms of size. We've done something pretty extreme, and we don't know how bad the troubles will be, whether we're going to be like Japan or something a lot worse. And what makes life interesting is we don't know how it's going to work out. I think we do know we're flirting with serious trouble. I think we also know that some of our earlier fears were overblown. Japan is still existing as a civilized nation, in spite of unbelievable excess by all former standards in terms of money printing. Think of how seductive it is. You have a bunch of interest-bearing debts, and you pay them off with checking accounts, which you're no longer paying interest. Think of how seductive that is for a bunch of legislators. You get rid of the interest payments and the money supply goes up. It seems like heaven. And of course, when things get that seductive, they're likely to be overused.
At the end of the day, realistically speaking, the Fed has only one choice to battle severe inflation, and that is to ruin the economy. Of course, we don't like to acknowledge that, so to make it sound more proper and publicly acceptable, we use words like tighten. But ultimately, tightening or raising rates creates harder and harder financial conditions, which eventually lead to job loss and economic ruin. And those exact things are what gets inflation under control. The dream of a soft landing is slowly fading away, and the last press conference Powell had, he even acknowledged this directly. Now the question is, how much will they have to tighten or how much will they have to ruin the economy before inflation is back in check? And if we take a look at history using the 1980s as an example, it's not very hard to predict that things will have to get a lot more hawkish before we ever fix this problem. Thank you guys for watching. As always, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed it.